I think it's a very difficult business to reach a complete consensus on an issue like this. That there is climate change and that the human beings are causing it or contributing to it, I think is consensus. Most of the scientists agree, and we have to go along with the scientific view, and I think it's a sensible view. What to do about it, and how much to do, that's a more difficult question, because it depends on how important you think today is compared to 100 years from now. That means this generation compared to the future generation. And if you are in Scandinavia, like here in Denmark, and they're having a good and high standard of living, well, they say, make sure my great-grandchildren will be okay. But if you are living in India or in China or in Africa, and the next meal is a problem, or as Lula said just now, 3 meals a day for us is still something to fight for, whereas in Denmark and developed countries, you achieved that long ago. Then your calculation will be different. You say, I'll solve this problem today first, and climate change later. So how much to do is a second problem. And the third problem is, let's assume we do it, who's going to pay? And of course, the developing countries says, well, the developed countries, you started first, you put all this stuff into the atmosphere, and you're still producing more than me and more per capita than me by big factor. So if you want me to cut back, first of all, I didn't cause a problem. Secondly, if I'm going to cut back, it's going to be more painful for me than for you, so you should pay me to do anything I cut back, and furthermore, you should pay me to adapt to the world which is changing as the climate is changing. So naturally, there's another big argument about funding, who's going to pay for whom. So therefore, this is a very difficult negotiation, and we're hoping to come up with a political statement from here. They're still negotiating, which is why I was late and was not sure I would come, because we were all waiting to see what could be settled, and really what is being settled is not between 200 countries, but between a few of the key major emitters, the developed countries, America, Japan, Europe, the major developing economies, they call them basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, China, India, one or two others. Who else? Russia. And then you have the countries which have got special interests. For example, the Association of Small Island States, AOSIS, which Singapore belongs to. And they are very paranoid because they are just slightly above sea level, and if the seas rise and they will be slightly below sea level, it's a completely different world. And to come from all this and to come to a consensus, even a political statement, I think we're not quite there yet. We're just trying to look after our interests, and our interests are to participate and do our part in the global deal, but at the same time make sure that our special circumstances are recognized, that we are what is called an alternative energy disadvantaged state. That means everything, all our energy comes from fossil fuel, and if you want to change to something else, you have very little of this something else. And we've got to have that acknowledged so that what we do within is within our limits, and we don't kill ourselves because we haven't put our case across and we've taken on obligations more than we are able to bear. And I think that's very important. Beyond that, we try to have a constructive role and participate so that where there's different views, we try and take a moderate position and help a consensus to form. But there are many countries in this process, and we're just one of the voices. We sympathize with the AOSIS countries because for them it's an existential issue. I mean, if the sea levels rise, they have a very serious problem. And they really have no solutions except to move house and pack up and go to some other place and hope that some other country will take them in. So we would like a good solution out of the UNFCCC talks. But I don't think that the AOSIS view will be the only view which will determine the outcome. You have to be realistic
about it. So what is
Singapore's,
as Singapore's a member of AOSIS, what's its exact role in this?
Our role is to work together with them, and where there are issues where we are aligned, well, we help them and they help us. And our interests are aligned insofar as we would all of us like to have a good solution. We're all of us small countries, and if you want to have your voice heard at all, you have to belong to a group, because if you're just one country, nobody will pay attention to you. But to have complete unanimity within the group, I think is not easy.
How about looking at ASEAN itself? Since Singapore is a key member in ASEAN also, is it possible to perhaps facilitate a much more united voice among ASEAN, or help in regional development in terms of adaptation?
I think regional development for adaptation is possible, but for ASEAN to have one voice is not easy, because the ASEAN countries are so different. We are alternative energy disadvantage. Laos has a lot of hydropower. In fact, they have a surplus of electricity there, and if we could buy it from them, we'd be happy, but it's a bit far away. Indonesia has a lot of coal. Malaysia has quite a lot of natural gas. Brunei, of course, is an oil state. So each of the countries is different, and I don't think on climate change it's easy for ASEAN to have one position. I think it's more realistic for each country to have to take into account its own circumstances, and we coordinate in a general way, but in fact our interests are not very closely aligned.
Just like to ask you, what do you foresee us as a role of youth, maybe perhaps in the next coming years? How are we going to facilitate the movement of to a greener Singapore in perhaps the next 5-10 years? And what can youth play in this whole movement?
Greener Singapore, I think first of all your own personal lifestyles is part of it. Your living, traveling, consumption habits. Have to take into account your carbon footprint, but in a sensible sort of way. I mean, it's helpful not to waste plastic bags, but even if you don't use any plastic bags, you're not going to save the world. To be quite realistic, you have to make a practical estimate of what makes a difference. In the longer term, your role is to understand these problems, and then in the next generation to produce a leadership so that you can help Singapore to cope in a world where energy is going to be more expensive, where carbon is likely to be priced in some form, and Singapore will have international obligations which we will have to meet, and at the same time we have to grow, and our own people have to be able to maintain their lives. No country can accept being green by being poor. It's not possible. I mean, you will be voted out straight away. But how to be not poor, how to live a comfortable and successful and prosperous life, and at the same time protect the environment. And I think you need idealistic people, especially young ones, who will go out and campaign and champion for good environmental causes, and make sure people pay attention to this, but at the same time have to be realistic, because if you go like Greenpeace, you know, and you take boats around and chase whaling ships, you can be very busy, but I don't think you will save Singapore. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
On behalf of
Very good to
the
meet you all.